Hey everyone! Tonight we embark on a journey that begins not with clashing steel or thundering hooves, but with a piece of fabric so delicate, so luxurious, that it was once the exclusive domain of emperors. We are diving deep into the history of the Mongol Empire, an unstoppable force that redefined warfare across 2 continents, yet whose greatest defensive secret lay incredibly in silk underwear. I want you to transport yourself to the vast, windswept steppes, or perhaps the cold, muddy fields of 13th century Hungary. The ground beneath you is shaking. You hear the high-pitched, terrifying whistle of thousands upon thousands of arrows launched simultaneously in artillery barrage made entirely of wood and feather. The Mongols are coming. You are a European knight, encased in layers of mail and leather, and you feel safe initially. You're ready for the first volley, but the Mongols didn't worry about the first volley. They were masters of the second volley and the third. Their genius was in ensuring their own cavalry could ride through that initial storm of enemy projectiles and deliver their own relentless, precise fire without being stopped by a critical, disabling wound. The terror wasn't just in the speed of the attack, but the inevitability of it. Imagine the relentless pounding. You trudge forward, your steel cap gleaming, but underneath that glorious metal, you're sweating, praying that your heavy armor holds up. You probably wouldn't survive this, by the way. Most men didn't. The sheer kinetic energy of a Mongol composite bowshot at close range could still shatter bones even if the arrowhead did unpenetrate. But look at the Mongol horseman charging towards you. He seems almost lightly dressed. He's wearing what looks like a quilted coat, maybe a helmet, and a few patches of leather. Where is the protection? Where is the steel that should be weighing him down? This light appearance is the ultimate deception and the key to his survival. He can ride farther, maneuver faster, and fight longer than you can. All because of that hidden layer beneath his tunic pressed tight against his skin, a lining of tightly woven silk. This wasn't some minor uniform detail. It was a counterintuitive, radical piece of military engineering designed not just to stop an arrow, but to specifically stop the very worst damage an arrow could inflict. It was the world's first truly successful form of lightweight, textile-based ballistic protection. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you? Let's map out our own historical journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We need to understand the strategic problem the Mongols solved, which was fundamentally about mobility. They weren't fighting like traditional armies. They were fighting like a giant mobile siege engine. Their speed was their shield, and traditional armor was their biggest enemy. They understood that if you are slowed down, even slightly, by heavy armor, you lose the battle before the arrows even fly. This innovation was born not of tradition, but of a brutal pragmatism. They needed armor that could withstand a punishing high-velocity impact, yet be light enough to be worn comfortably for weeks on end while riding a fast, tough steppe pony across unimaginable distances. This simple, silky lining was the answer that terrified emperors and redefined the concept of personal protection for centuries to come. The goal was simple: get hit, keep riding, and fire back. And they achieved it with a material usually reserved for weddings and imperial decrees. The Mongol military machine was, above all else, a monument to efficiency. It wasn't built on brute force or insurmountable numbers, though they certainly brought force to bear. It was built on the principle of maximum effect with minimal logistical burden. When you analyze the Mongol approach, you realize that their entire way of life, from their diet of dried meat and fermented milk to their short, hardy horses, to their military formation, the Tumen was engineered for relentless movement. And that focus on mobility immediately created a fundamental conflict with the prevailing military technologies of the time. Think about the European knight we just left, struggling in his steel. His plate armor might have offered superb protection against a direct lance charge or a sword stroke, but it came at a monumental cost. Weight. A full suit of 13th century European plate and mail could easily weigh between 50 and 70 pounds, distributed unevenly, making walking a chore and fighting a marathon. Try putting that on a horse and galloping for 80 miles a day, every day, for 3 weeks straight. It's simply not feasible. The horse would collapse, and the soldier would be perpetually exhausted, often having to be hoisted onto his mount by assistants. The Mongols, however, covered distances that defy modern imagination. A Kaisig Imperial Guard unit could reliably cover over 100 miles a day during a forced march. Utilizing multiple mounts per rider, their entire strategic advantage lay in arriving where they were least expected, encircling foes, and never letting the enemy rest. Heavy, traditional plate armor was therefore not just impractical, it was an existential threat to their doctrine. If they adopted it, they ceased to be the Mongols. Their traditional defenses were often segmented leather, hardened by boiling or lacquer, supplemented by small, overlapping iron plates lamellar armor, which offered flexibility but was still vulnerable to dedicated piercing weapons. The engineers under Genghis Khan needed something revolutionary, armor that felt like clothing but stopped arrows better than steel. The concept of using metal for their primary body defense was simply rejected because it did not align with their need for speed. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's initial focus on textile armor was a clever innovation or a necessity forced by the initial lack of equality, iron ore on the steppes. Either way, the solution was brilliant. Imagine you are one of those engineers, tasked with protecting a horseman who must fight for 12 hours straight in the saddle, sometimes in blistering heat, sometimes in frozen sleet, and who has no supply chain for massive repairs. You can't use heavy metal. What's your alternative? You look at what you have in abundance: captured textiles, animal hides, and felt from the yurts. You start experimenting with layering, with stitching, with density. You realize that stopping an arrow is not just about rigidity, it's about flexibility and energy absorption. This is where the idea of the silk undergarment, the padded jacket, takes root. It's an armor system that sacrifices absolute resistance to a direct sword blow for phenomenal, lightweight protection against the most common battlefield killer of the time, the arrow. The Mongols understood that they weren't fighting an army of dueling champions. They were fighting masses of men who would be neutralized by projectile weapons long before close combat. And what better way to neutralize the enemy's main weapon than to render their arrows harmless, or at least minimize the nasty effects of penetration? It's a subtle but crucial distinction. European armor was often designed to deflect or resist. Mongol armor, specifically the silk layer, was designed to catch and absorb. This engineering philosophy is what allowed a lightly armored rider to survive an assault that would typically have pinned a heavier, slower man to his saddle. They took a soft item, a piece of underwear, and made it the ultimate hard defense. It's the kind of innovation that, frankly, sounds like a drunken dare until you see it work on the battlefield, which we'll get to soon. Now, let us step momentarily onto the receiving end of a Mongol attack to fully appreciate the problem they were trying to solve: the tyranny of the arrow. The Mongol forces were not just archers, they were mobile artillery platforms. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, often made from horn, sinew, and wood, laminated together to create enormous stored energy. These bows could launch arrows further, flatter, and with more force than most contemporary European or Chinese bows. Imagine you are standing in formation, shields raised. The volume of fire is terrifying, a genuine whistling storm that blocks out the sun. The Mongols deployed disciplined units in wave after wave, raining down thousands of arrows per minute. A mainstream historical fact is that a well-drilled Mongol archer could fire up to 12 arrows per minute. Sustaining this rate for significant periods, cycling between the powerful heavy arrows for penetration and lighter arrows for harassing fire. The real danger, however, lay in the arrowheads themselves. These weren't always the broad surgical points favored by English longbowmen. Mongol arrows came in a nasty variety of specialized tips, some wide for cutting, some slender for piercing armor, and crucially, many were hardened, narrow, and designed to puncture. When one of these arrows struck a soldier wearing typical defensiza, simple, thick leather jerkin, or even mail over padding it, often resulted in a devastating injury. Even if the mail stopped the tip from fully entering, the impact could still shatter the underlying bone or cause massive blunt trauma. But let's consider the specific nasty outcome the silk was designed to prevent. When a normal iron arrow pierces a thick piece of padded fabric or leather, the material tends to tear and bunch up. The arrowhead, especially if it has barbs or a rough surface, enters and then sticks. The body's immediate reaction to the foreign object, combined with the material being pushed into the wound cavity, makes removal incredibly difficult. Medically, this often meant a disabling wound, high risk of infection, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, and often the death of the soldier. Even if the initial wound wasn't fatal, the subsequent removal of the arrow, often requiring deep cutting and further damage, was usually a battlefield surgeon's nightmare. The Mongol engineers recognized that stopping the arrow was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring that if the armor failed to stop the projectile completely, the resulting injury was clean and survivable. They weren't just thinking tactically, they were thinking medically and logistically. A lightly wounded man could remount and fight another day. A man pinned to his saddle by a deeply embedded arrow was a liability. The quirky tidbit here is that in some later Mongol and post-Mongol armies, certain specialized archers would use whistling arrowhead small bone or horn whistles attached behind the tip knot, primarily for damage, but to create a terrifying psychological effect. During a mass volley, making the enemy believe the arrow storm was even closer and more overwhelming than it was. Imagine being under fire and hearing that constant high-pitched shriek. Historians still argue whether the invention of the multi-layered silk armor was a purely indigenous Mongol idea, or if the concept was adapted from earlier Chinese or Central Asian techniques. Regardless of its origin, the Mongols industrialized its production and made it a mandatory part of their military kit. It was standardized, issued, and relied upon as much as their horses and bows. It transformed the vulnerability of light cavalry into a highly protected, yet lightning-fast force multiplier. You watch as a volley hits the Mongol riders. Most of the arrows simply bounce off the leather and segmented armor. But for those that penetrate, the outcome will be surprisingly less lethal than you, the enemy, expect. The fundamental problem facing any military engineer, from the Bronze Age to today, boils down to a brutal calculus: the trade-off between protection and mobility. We saw how the Mongol doctrine demanded high mobility, which naturally led them away from the heavy metal armor prevalent in other parts of the world. This section focuses on the physics of that decision, specifically the tyranny of metal. Look again at the European knight. His armor is magnificent. It's built on rigidity and mass. To stop a sword stroke or a heavy lance, you need density. Whether it was the interlocking rings of chainmail, often called mail, or just mail, or the solid contoured plates of steel, the material worked by either deflecting the strike, the curved plates, or by absorbing the blow and spreading the force, the mail. The sheer mass and stiffness of the metal were what provided the defense. A mainstream historical fact is that the peak efficiency of late medieval European plate armor meant that it was nearly impervious to piercing weapons in the hands of all but the strongest men. But that efficiency came at the expense of needing constant, specialized maintenance and a strong warhorse to carry the load. Now, consider the application of that metal to the Mongol lifestyle. For a Mongol soldier, mobility meant being able to switch horses quickly, dismount rapidly to fire arrows, and maintain physical fighting fitness for days on end without the assistance of a retinue. Heavy metal armor would have exhausted the soldier and his mounts, drastically limiting the range and speed of the entire army. Even if they had access to perfect steel, they would have rejected it on strategic grounds. The quirky tidbit here is that early attempts by some Central Asian tribes, who later assimilated into the Mongol system to adopt full metal lamellar armor, often failed because the noise it generated, the constant jingling and scraping of the overlapping plates, made stealthy approach and communication on the battlefield nearly impossible. The sheer auditory signature of the armor compromised their surprise tactics. The design flaw in relying solely on metal armor for the Mongols was clear. If you cannot rapidly move and outmaneuver the enemy, you lose the ability to choose when and where you fight. You become predictable, and predictability is death on the step. The metal armor provided too much resistance for a localized blow, but its overall weight provided too much inertia to the wearer, slowing down the entire war machine. This is why the Mongol solution of layering textile armor was so profoundly innovative. They realized that stopping a high-velocity, small-diameter projectile, like an arrow, does not require the same brute mass needed to stop a slow, heavy sword. It requires tensile strength, the ability of a material to resist being pulled apart. Silk, despite its light weight, possesses extraordinary tensile strength. Historians still argue whether the engineers intuitively understood the principles of energy dispersal or arrived at the multi-layered design purely through empirical battlefield testing. But the outcome was the same. They created a system where the first few layers of padding, felt or cottonwood, absorbed the kinetic energy. and the critical inner layer of silk would then crucially snare the projectile. This was a system that worked on the micro level of the fiber rather than the macro level of the plate. Imagine you are wearing 10 thick sweaters made of the strongest possible thread, one on top of the other. The weight is manageable, and the layers act independently to slow the penetrating object. The Mongol textile armor, sometimes called katandel or simply a padded coat, was this concept refined to perfection. It was a garment that weighed perhaps 1/10 of a full suit of steel armor, yet provided a high probability of survival against the single most lethal weapon they faced, the armor-piercing arrow. The final product was a synthesis of lightweight, field repairability, and targeted protection, a perfect fit for the nomadic warrior. The pivot from heavy metal armor to layered textiles was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice championed by the military leadership, particularly under Genghis Khan, who understood that innovation was the currency of conquest. This brings us to the Indranether's strategic mind, often overlooked in the romanticized image of the charging horde. Genghis Khan was notorious for his ruthlessness, but also for his brutal pragmatism and his absolute intolerance for military stagnation. He didn't just conquer, he absorbed the best technologies and personnel from the cultures he subjugated. When the Mongols conquered cities and regions, they didn't just take gold and slaves, they forcibly conscripted artisans, scholars, and especially engineers and siege specialists. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mongol army often integrated entire contingents of specialized engineers, particularly from the captured cities of the Jin dynasty and later the Islamic world, using their expertise in areas like siege, warfare, and critically material science. Genghis demanded solutions that maximized troop survivability without compromising the speed that was his strategic trump card. The core demand from the Khan was a material with a high strength-out ratio. In modern terms, we'd be looking at advanced composites. In the 13th century, this meant looking beyond the traditional limitations of leather and iron. The engineers had to solve the riddle of the arrow. How do you stop a tiny projectile traveling at immense velocity with a light, flexible garment? The answer, as they soon discovered through empirical, often bloody testing, lay in the structural properties of certain fibers. The quirky tidbit here relates to the Mongol discipline regarding their equipment. Soldiers were strictly forbidden from discarding any part of their issued gear, including torn or seemingly insignificant padding. Everything was recoverable and recyclable. This hyper-efficiency meant that even damaged silk layers were saved, unpicked, and rewoven or repurposed, fostering a culture of continuous material assessment among the engineers. The strategic focus shifted to silk for several reasons. Firstly, its extraordinary tensile strength was known, even if the underlying physics weren't. Secondly, access to silk became virtually unlimited after the conquests of northern China and control of the critical trade routes. It moved from being an exotic luxury item to a readily available industrial raw material. Thirdly, it had an inherent resistance to moisture and rot that many other organic fibers lacked, making it ideal for troops who lived permanently in the saddle across varying climates. Historians still argue whether the engineers' initial focus was on the silk fiber itself or on the quilting technique adapted from padded cotton armors. It's likely a fusion of both. The idea was to create a dense fabric structure that would not tear when punctured by a needle-like arrowhead, but would instead snare the tip. The silk provided the necessary internal strength, and the quilted layering provided the structural mass and tension. Imagine you are one of these captured engineers, kneeling on the step. You've seen leather fail and iron slow down the precious cavalry. You hold a piece of raw, tightly woven silk. You realize that its strength doesn't come from being hard, but from being unbelievably tough to pull apart. You start layering it, stitching it tightly into the traditional quilted coat known as the katanda. You are not making a new form of armor. You are inventing the fundamental principle of ballistic fabric, using a web of high-strength fibers to distribute the kinetic energy of the projectile across the entire weave. The engineers, by leveraging silk, provided Genghis Khan not just with a piece of protective gear, but with a strategic weapon. The Mongol cavalry could now absorb hits, suffer fewer crippling injuries, and remain operational longer than any of their heavily armored counterparts. This innovation ensured that the Mongol war machine could maintain its terrifying momentum. Turning the delicate output of a silkworm into an empire-building defensive shield, our focus now narrows onto the material itself, silk. The paradox is that this fiber, synonymous with softness, luxury, and fragility, became the cornerstone of the world's most terrifying defensive system. We need to understand the material properties that transform a simple piece of fabric into a bulletproof layer, or, in this case, an arrow-proof layer. At the microscopic level, silk is not what it appears to be. It is not cotton or wool. Silk fibers, produced by silkworms, are continuous filaments of protein, specifically fibrin. Unlike other natural fibers, which are short, brittle segments that have to be spun together, silk is essentially one long, incredibly smooth, and uniform strand. A mainstream historical fact is that a single silkworm cocoon can yield a continuous filament up to 1,000 meters long. This continuous structure gives silk its phenomenal tensile strength. Imagine trying to break a long piece of thread versus a short, bumpy piece of string. The silk is far more resistant to being pulled apart. When an arrow strikes a dense layer of silk, the force isn't absorbed by brittle breakages. It's immediately distributed along the immense length of the fibers. The energy of the projectile is dispersed across the entire woven matrix, preventing the localized tear that would normally occur in leather or felt. The ingenious part of the Mongol design was creating a defense that leveraged silk's specific weakness. It is actually quite easy to cut with a sharp blade under slow pressure. But under sudden, intense, localized stress like an arrow tip moving at high velocities, silk behaves totally differently. The velocity of the tip is so high that it doesn't have time to cleanly shear the millions of interwoven fibers. Instead, the fibers surrounding the impact point stretch and tighten instantly, creating a powerful netting effect. The quirky tidbit here is that the Mongols sometimes incorporated silk into their own flag standards, not just because it was a valuable material, but because of its battlefield durability. A silk banner, even when shredded by a blade, often wouldn't tear into complete pieces as wool or linen would, meaning the symbol of the commander could often remain visible longer, maintaining troop morale. Historians still argue whether the optimal material used by the Mongols was the highest grade bombyx mori silk, or if they often used a coarser, cheaper wild silk. The consensus leans toward a relatively high-grade, tightly woven, multiple-ply fabric, as the integrity of the defense was absolutely critical. Picture the moment of impact. The arrow pierces the outer layers of padding and felt. This initial penetration strips away a great deal of the arrow's kinetic energy, but the silk layers underneath are stitched so tightly that they form a compact, non-elastic wall. As the arrow's tip hits the silk, the tip cannot cleanly push the fibers aside. Instead, the fibers resist the puncture, stretch around the tip, and snare it, drawing the rest of the arrow into the weave. This action pulls the fabric tight around the arrowhead, forming a localized hammock that effectively halts the penetration. The key is that the silk doesn't break, it stretches and contains. This material property meant that even if the arrow did pierce through the entire thickness of the katandel, the silk fibers often wrapped themselves so tightly around the arrowhead that when the archer or a medic pulled the arrow out of the wound, the silk liner acted like a clean surgical sheath, pulling the arrowhead and any potentially contaminated material cleanly out with it. This dramatically reduced the risk of deep tissue infection and inflammation, a critical factor in battlefield survivability in an age before antibiotics. The paradox of silk is that its luxurious flexibility became its martial strength, turning a textile into an early form of kinetic energy absorber. The transition of silk from a highly prized commodity and innerwear luxury to a critical piece of military defense marks a profound cultural and logistical shift within the burgeoning Mongol Empire. Before the Great Conquests, silk held a complex status in Central Asia. For the Mongols themselves, whose traditional material was felt and leather, silk was primarily obtained through tribute, trade, or raiding, and it was often worn close to the skin as a soft, hygienic undergarment, the delbini coarse outer clothing. The change accelerated after the Mongol conquest of northern China, culminating in the destruction of the Jin dynasty and the subsequent control of the heartland of silk production. Suddenly, what had been a resource bottleneck, a rare precious material, became a resource surplus. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mongols gained control of large parts of the ancient Silk Road networks, and rather than just taxing the trade, they actively utilized the infrastructure to supply their military machine with high-volume raw materials, foremost among them being silk. Imagine the traditional perspective. Silk is expensive. It signifies wealth, status, and refinement. It is the ultimate anti-martial garment. Then you have the Mongol engineers, under the pragmatic command of the Khan, who look at this precious commodity and see not luxury, but tensile fiber. They saw its functional properties were far superior to any local organic material they possessed for resisting a piercing weapon. The cultural shift was the willingness to take the most valuable textile and stitch it, layer it, and dirty it in the mud of 1,000 battlefields, all in the service of survivability. The key to this transition was standardization and volume. The Mongols essentially industrialized the production of their layered defensive garments. Instead of the tailor creating a unique, luxurious dell for a nobleman, the military workshops were tasked with churning out thousands of uniform, multi-layered silk liners for the Tumen. The quirky tidbit here is that in Chinese tradition, wearing silk next to the skin was also believed to help ward off insects and parasites in the field, due to its smooth, tightly woven texture, which offered fewer places for pests to nest. While not a primary military function, this secondary benefit only added to the silk garment's value for a constantly campaigning army. This move was a radical departure from traditional military procurement. Most armies outfitted themselves primarily with what was locally available or icily forged. The Mongols, however, turned their vast conquests into an integrated supply chain, prioritizing battlefield effectiveness over material cost. The expense of the silk was considered a worthwhile investment, saving the life of a trained cavalryman a resource far more valuable than a few yards of fabric. Historians still argue whether the initial use of silk as a defense was discovered, accidentally perhaps by a soldier wearing a layered silk undergarment who survived a non-fatal arrow wound that snagged in the fabric, or if it was the result of deliberate, systematic material testing by captive Chinese artisans. Whatever the spark, the adoption was swift and total because it offered such a dramatic, lightweight advantage against the archers of the opposing armies. This was the moment silk fully transitioned from underwear to utility. It became the hidden layer of defense, a military secret worn directly against the body, sandwiched between the soldier's skin and the outer layers of hardened leather or felt. This placement was strategic. The silk needed to be held taut and flat against the body by the outer garment to function optimally. The tight pressure maximized the netting effect, ensuring that when the arrow tip reached the silk, it was instantly confronted by a dense, unyielding web of heightened-style fiber designed to catch, snag, and contain. Once the Mongol engineers settled on silk as the key protective element, the next crucial step was the manufacturing process. It wasn't enough to simply wear a silk tunic. The fiber had to be prepared, layered, and secured in a very specific manner to maximize its ballistic properties. This step involved mastering the crucial stitch, the precise construction method that turned luxurious fabric into defensive composite armor. The garment wasn't a loose layer. It was a tightly integrated component of the overall Khatan Del, or battle coat. A mainstream historical fact is that the silk was often layered between 8 and 10 times, sometimes more, depending on the thickness of the individual bolt of fabric. These layers were not sewn loosely together. They were densely quilted. Imagine stitching a heavy blanket hundreds of times, making the final result stiff and compact. The stitching pattern was critical. It had to hold the layers under tension. If the layers were free to shift, the impact of an arrow would simply push one layer aside at a time, allowing for deeper penetration. The quilting, often done in tight vertical lines or diamond patterns, served to bind the plies together, creating a singular, cohesive sheet of material that was highly resistant to localized tearing. The closer the stitches, the more rigid and tensioned the final fabric composite became, and the better it performed its function. This density achieved two things simultaneously. First, it ensured that the force of the arrow hitting the outer layer of silk was immediately distributed across the entire weave of all 10 layers, minimizing the stress on any single point. Second, the tight tension of the stitches maximized the snaring capacity of the individual fibers. The quirky tidbit here is that the Mongols sometimes utilized two different colors of thread, for the quilting one color for the inner layer and another for the outer layer. This was not decorative. It was a quality control measure, allowing supervisors to icily see if the stitch depth was consistent throughout the entire thickness of the garment, ensuring the material tension was uniform. The silk layer was almost always placed closest to the body, beneath layers of felt, leather, or sometimes even small metal plates, lamellar. This positioning was strategic. The outer layers absorbed the initial kinetic energy and helped hold the silk taut against the skin. If an arrow did manage to pass through the outer defenses, the silk would then perform its final critical task. Historians still argue whether the quilting was done exclusively by hand in military workshops, or if certain regions specialized in using early forms of mechanized stitching, like large frame looms. To speed up the massive production required for a continuous campaign army, given the sheer scale of the Mongol military, efficiency in production was paramount. The end product was a garment that looked superficially like a heavy padded jacket, but functioned like a highly sophisticated fiber net. When an arrow's hardened, needle-like tip encountered this tightly stitched silk composite, the material would resist the immediate displacement. Instead of breaking, the silk fibers would stretch, wrap around the arrowhead, and, crucially, begin to pull the tip sideways and stop its forward momentum. The entire mechanism relied entirely on the integrity of this tight stitching. It wasn't just tailoring, it was textile engineering. Without the high density and the high tension provided by the crucial stitch, the silk would have merely been soft, expensive cloth. With it, it became the world's first mass-produced lightweight ballistic armor, allowing the Mongol rider to absorb a projectile hit and remain in the fight. We now arrive at the core physics of the innovation, the mechanism of the stop. How exactly does a soft, silky layer, especially one worn underneath a heavy coat, manage to stop an armor-piercing arrowhead? This is where the Mongol engineers transcended simple tailoring and entered the realm of advanced ballistic defense. The process is a sequence of energy absorption and fiber action. When a high-velocity projectile, like an armor-piercing Mongol arrow, strikes the Khatan Dele, it first encounters the outer layers, often hardened leather, felt, or quilted cotton. These layers are crucial for slowing the arrow down. They are the kinetic energy sponges. They absorb the initial brutal impact, reducing the speed of the projectile significantly. However, these outer layers, made of less tensile material, often tear apart as the sharp tip passes through. The arrow is slowed, but not stopped. It's when the tip reaches the densely layered, tightly stitched silk inner liner that the real magic happens. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary defense mechanism of the silk was not its strength to resist penetration like a steel plate, but its flexibility and high tensile strength to snare the projectile. The arrow tip, trying to force its way between the tightly packed silk fibers, finds its path obstructed by a non-rigid, incredibly tough network. Instead of shearing cleanly, the fibers resist being displaced. They stretch around the invading tip. Imagine pulling a fishing net tight around a needle. The needle can pierce one string, but the rest of the net immediately tightens around the puncture point. That is essentially what the multi-layered silk does. As the tip pushes inward, the silk fibers immediately adjacent to the point snag the arrow tip and shaft. Because these fibers are continuous and extremely strong, the energy that was once focused on the tiny point of the arrowhead is instantly dispersed across a vast area of the fabric, perhaps several square inches. This process is called delocalization of force. The energy of the arrow, instead of being used to create a large tear at one point, is spread out. The collective force required to break all the stretched, integrated silk fibers simultaneously is far greater than the force delivered by the single arrow. The arrow is stopped, not by brute resistance, but by a microscopic height-and-style net that captures it. The quirky tidbit here is that the slight friction generated by the arrow shaft sliding through the layers of silk and felt also contributed to the overall stopping power. This microfriction acted as a final, tiny break, ensuring that even if the arrow got close to passing through, its momentum was utterly spent. Historians still argue whether the type of silk weave, such as plain, twill, or satin, played a more crucial role than the sheer density and tightness of the quilting. Most evidence points to the tightness of the weave and the high-density quilting being the crucial factors, as this maximized the number of individual fibers available to snag and distribute the force. Furthermore, because the silk fibers tend to wrap around the arrow tip, when the soldier or medic pulls the arrow out, the embedded arrowhead often stays wrapped in the silk, allowing the entire projectile to be withdrawn relatively cleanly, reducing the risk of leaving contaminated fragments like dirt, cloth, or jagged metal deep inside the tissue. This not only stopped the projectile, but offered a crucial, life-saving medical benefit. This was not merely armor, it was integrated. Lightweight ballistic protection that addressed both the kinetic and the biological threat of the projectile. With the theoretical engineering complete, the silk armor needed its baptism by fire, and it received it at the Battle of Yehuling, or the Battle of Wild Fox Ridge. In 1211, a pivotal engagement against the formidable Jin dynasty in northern China. This battle served as the ultimate testing ground for Genghis Khan's entire system of warfare, including the new lightweight, textile-based protection. You are placed on the front lines of the Mongol attack, facing the fortified positions of the Jin. The Jin dynasty was a technologically advanced foe, fielding heavy cavalry, complex defenses, and disciplined infantry equipped with powerful composite bows of their own, designed to punch through leather and even lighter lamellar armor. The Mongols needed their innovation to hold up against a professional, well-equipped military force that wasn't used to yielding ground. A mainstream historical fact is that the Jin deployed massive forces, estimated at over 300,000 men, arrayed in dense formations, which should have been impervious to a frontal assault by the comparatively smaller and lighter Mongol army. The Mongols, however, used their superior mobility and their ability to endure enemy fire to execute rapid feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers, the famous TLGTR tactic. Imagine the Jin archers unleashing a concentrated volley into the charging Mongol cavalry. Normally, an arrow storm like this would thin the ranks, disabling enough riders to break the momentum of the charge. But now, you see something unexpected. Riders are struck, but they remain in the saddle. They might flinch from the impact, remember the issue of blunt trauma, but they are not falling, pinned to their horses by deeply embedded shafts. The multi-layered silk beneath their tunics is holding firm, snaring the Jin armor-piercing arrows. The quirky tidbit here is that after the battle, Mongol soldiers often collected the arrows that had struck their armor. These arrows were prized not only for recycling the shafts and feathers, but as proof of the armor's effectiveness. A tightly snagged arrow with its tip wrapped in silk fibers was a trophy of survival. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for the Mongol victory at Yehuling was the new armor, or if it was the superior tactical genius of Genghis Khan and his generals. While tactics were undoubtedly key, the armor provided the crucial margin of survivability, allowing the Mongol troops to absorb hits and stay in the fight long enough to execute their complex maneuvers rather than becoming casualties that required immediate evacuation. The armor ensured that the Mongols could press their advantage without suffering crippling personnel losses from enemy archers. The Battle of Yehuling confirmed that the engineer's design was viable. It proved that a soldier, wearing essentially a quilted silk undershirt, could withstand the most common lethal threat on the battlefield. This eliminated the need for heavy, cumbersome armor, fully freeing the Mongol cavalry to utilize the speed and endurance that was central to their strategic doctrine. From this point on, the textile armor became mandatory. It was no longer an experiment. It was a non-negotiable part of the Mongol kit. The success at Yehuling validated the cultural shift. Silk was now a weapon of war. More important than any other single piece of defensive gear, it was the moment the world's first form of mass-produced ballistic fabric proved its worth on a grand, terrifying scale, paving the way for the further expansion of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen, while the silk layer proved exceptionally effective at snaring and stopping the penetration of the arrowhead. The problem of momentum remained. You might stop the tip, but you haven't eliminated the brute force that propelled the arrow. This brings us to the secondary threat: blunt trauma and shock. Imagine the sensation. An arrow fired from a composite bow hits you at several hundred feet per second, even if the tip is caught by the silk. The sudden transfer of all that kinetic energy into your body is immense. It's like being hit by a small, high-speed hammer. The silk layer, being non-rigid, transfers much of this force through the fibers and directly into your torso. While you haven't suffered a fatal puncture, you could still sustain fractured ribs, internal bruising, or organ damage, a disabling, non-lethal injury that would take you out of the fight just as surely as a deep wound. The Mongol engineers, with their pragmatism, recognized this issue quickly. The silk was the penetration defense, but it needed an additional component to serve as the shock absorber. A mainstream historical fact is that the outer layers of the katan dela, the thick padding made of cotton, felt, or even layers of raw hide, were deliberately integrated to mitigate this blunt trauma. These thicker, softer materials served as a compressible cushion, increasing the distance and time over which the arrow's momentum was arrested. Think of it in terms of crash protection. The silk is the seatbelt, stopping you from flying out the window, but the felt and padding are the airbags, cushioning the impact of the sudden stop. The layers of felt and cotton, though easily pierced, were thick enough to crumple and compress, soaking up a significant percentage of the kinetic energy before the arrow reached the critical silk layer. The quirky tidbit here is that Mongol soldiers sometimes deliberately soaked the outer layers of their padding in water before a battle in certain climates. This increased the density and stiffness of the felt upon drying, making it even more resistant to both penetration and, perhaps more effectively, increasing its mass for better shock absorption. Historians still argue whether the thickness of the padding or the density of the silk was considered the more important component by the Mongol designers. The truth is that they operated as a synergistic system. The padding absorbed the shock and velocity, and the silk provided the final decisive stop against penetration. One without the other was incomplete. Without the padding, the silk would have been too thin to disperse the force effectively, potentially leading to deep internal bruising even if the skin wasn't broken. Without the silk, the padding would have been instantly pierced. You are the soldier who has just been hit. You gasp, winded, possibly nauseous from the impact, but you are not bleeding. You are still mounted. You can still hold your bow. This is the difference. The design goal was not to make the soldier impervious, no armor could do that, but to make the soldier recoverable. It shifted a potentially lethal or disabling injury into a temporary, painful shock. You clutch your side, take a deep breath, knock another arrow, and re-engage. The secondary threat was managed by the engineers, not through an exotic new material, but through the clever, optimized layering of common textiles, confirming the adage that the simplest solutions are often the best. The genius of the silk armor system extended far beyond the immediate battlefield defense. It was a logistical masterstroke, profoundly simplifying the life of a soldier perpetually on the move. This section explores the practicality of maintenance, a factor often overlooked but critical to the success of the Mongol war machine. The typical Mongol campaign involved distances and durations that would cripple any medieval army reliant on heavy logistics. Their armies traveled light, foraging and subsisting primarily off their herds. In this environment, heavy metal armor, such as mail or plate, presented constant, severe problems. A mainstream historical fact is that iron and steel armor required constant oiling and attention to prevent rust, especially in humid or rainy climates. Rust would weaken the metal, compromise the joints, and necessitate heavy, specialized tools for repair tools that the fast-moving Mongols simply did not carry. Now, consider the multi-layered textile armor. It was incredibly forgiving. The silk itself is highly resistant to moisture degradation, a huge advantage over leather and most other fibers, and, crucially, doesn't rust. The outer layers of felt and hide, while they could get waterlogged, were easy to dry and repair with basic tools. A tear in the padding or a snag in the silk could be fixed by the soldier himself, or a camp artisan using nothing more than a needle and thread, often reusing the abundant silk scraps. Imagine you are a Mongol cavalryman. You've been riding for weeks, and your coat has taken a hit from an arrow. The outer layer is torn, and the silk liner has snagged the tip. The repair process is straightforward. Pull the arrow out, often cleanly, thanks to the silk. Remember? Cut away the damaged outer material and patch the layers with new cloth. The armor is instantly combat-ready again. Compare this to repairing a shattered steel plate, which requires a traveling forge, a skilled armorer, and days of painstaking work. The logistical advantage of the textile armor was that it allowed the army to remain virtually autonomous for extended periods. They did not need to wait for supply wagons carrying specialized metalworking tools or fresh plates of steel. They carried their repair kit with them. This enhanced the Mongol strategic ability to execute deep penetrations and surprise attacks, as they were never tethered to a fixed supply line. The quirky tidbit here relates to the Mongol tradition of wearing their armor close to the body, often without removing it for days. The silk, being breathable and relatively smooth, was more comfortable than rough wool or scratchy mail rubbing against the skin, which inadvertently increased hygiene and decreased the risk of skin infections caused by friction and dirt, another factor contributing to the overall health and readiness of the troops. Historians still argue whether the perceived lightness of the Mongol soldier by their European opponents was due to a lack of armor, or if it was the strategic use of lightweight, layered defenses. The textile armor made the soldier appear light and unarmored, contributing to the psychological edge while in reality, they were adequately protected against the most common threat. The practicalities of maintenance meant that the Mongol engineer had produced a perfectly sustainable weapon system, one that fit their nomadic lifestyle like a glove. It was lightweight, easily repairable, non-rusting, and could be produced in massive volumes from conquered materials. This was not just a protective garment, it was a military efficiency tool, allowing the light cavalry to stay in the saddle, stay fighting, and maintain the relentless pace that defined their empire-building conquest. As the Mongol campaigns progressed and their technological understanding matured, the initial simple silk lining evolved into a sophisticated, multi-component armor system. This transition involved the deliberate and precise integration of other materials, leading to the creation of quilted protection that balanced shock absorption with ballistic resistance. The Katandel was never just silk. It was a composite structure. A mainstream historical fact is that the structure typically layered 5 to 10 sheets of silk, sandwiched between layers of other materials, most commonly cotton, felt often made from sheep or yak hair, and sometimes thin lacquered leather or rawhide. The outer layers provided the bulk, the durability, and the shock absorption we discussed earlier. Imagine the cross-section of the garment. You have the rough outer layer, perhaps a strong hide, which provides abrasion resistance and a slight deflecting property. Beneath that, you have several inches of densely packed felt and cotton batting held taut by the tight quilting. This is the cushioning mass, essential for dissipating the arrow's kinetic energy and mitigating the secondary blunt trauma. Finally, pressed closest to the soldier's body is the tightly stitched, temply layer of height-and-style silk. The crucial role of the cotton and felt was to provide the necessary structure and thickness. If the garment was only thin silk, the impact force would be too localized, and the silk would either tear or transfer the shock violently into the body. The thicker materials increased the stopping distance for the arrow. The further the arrow has to penetrate even through soft, compressible material, the more momentum it loses. The quirky tidbit here is that the type of felt used was sometimes tailored to the environment. In colder northern campaigns, the felt layers would be significantly thicker, providing essential thermal insulation alongside ballistic protection. This adaptability meant the same fundamental armor system could be deployed effectively from the frozen steppes of Russia to the scorching deserts of Persia. Historians still argue whether the glue or lacquer sometimes applied to the outer leather or hide layers was primarily for waterproofing, stiffening the fabric to aid deflection, or for repelling arrows. Evidence suggests it served a combination of purposes, but fundamentally contributed to the rigidity of the outermost shell, providing the first line of defense before the arrow reached the yielding felt and the resilient silk. The layering was an engineering triumph because it understood that no single material could solve the problem alone. Metal provided resistance, but lacked mobility. Cotton and felt provided cushion, but lacked tensile strength. Silk provided tensile strength, but lacked bulk. By carefully combining these materials held together by precise quilting, the Mongol engineers created a highly optimized system. You, the soldier, benefit from the combined strengths of all these materials, wearing a light, durable, and highly protective garment that is, essentially, an early form of a composite armor system, allowing you to endure the enemy's most feared weapon without being slowed down by the bulky, traditional defenses of your foes. While the layered silken felt offered exceptional protection against the high-velocity, small-diameter threat of the arrow, it was crucial to acknowledge the armor's limitations. No armor is impervious. And the primary weakness of this textile composite system was its vulnerability to low velocity. HIMARS weapons, specifically the spear and the dedicated thrust. Imagine a close-quarters engagement. You are no longer dealing with a projectile traveling at immense speed, but with a determined infantryman wielding a heavy, thrusting spear or a sharp sword, while the silk excelled at snaring and distributing the energy of a sharp point impacting at high speed. It was less effective against a heavy, deliberate thrust delivered by a mainstream historical fact is that the structure of the woven silk, while strong in tension, could be parted by a slow, concentrated force that allowed the sharp point to push the fibers aside instead of instantly snagging them. The lack of rigid steel plates meant that the armor offered relatively weak resistance against dedicated stabbing. This limitation forced the Mongol soldier to rely on supplementary defenses and superior tactics in close combat. To mitigate this weakness, the Mongols often supplemented their textile armor in close-quarters engagements. They frequently wore lamellar armor, small, overlapping iron or hardened leather plates over their vital areas, such as the chest and back, often integrated into the outer layers of the katan de del. These plates provided the necessary rigidity to deflect a spear or sword thrust. Furthermore, they relied heavily on large circular shields made of leather, or simply avoided prolonged melee combat altogether, preferring to use their speed to dictate the range of the engagement. Historians still argue whether the katan del was ever intended to be a full-spectrum defense, or if it was strictly optimized for projectile protection. Assuming that the mobility of the Mongol cavalry would prevent them from being consistently cornered by heavy infantry and their spears, the evidence points to the latter. The armor was designed for the most likely threat arrows and the most crucial factor, mobility. The quirky tidbit here is that Marco Polo in his accounts mentions the great toughness of the Mongol armor and their use of leather, but he also noted the effectiveness of their horses' defenses, which were often covered in lacquer-hardened leather, indicating a holistic approach to protection for both rider and mount rather than a sole focus on the rider's textile armor. When you, the Mongol soldier, find yourself face-to-face with an enemy lancer, the fight changes completely. You are no longer relying on your armor to stop the weapon. You are relying on your horsemanship, your curved saber, and your speed to avoid being hit in the first place. You must be nimble, dodging the powerful thrusts that could potentially punch through the quilted layers. The overall effectiveness of the textile armor lay in its strategic role. It ensured that the majority of the army, which operated primarily as mobile archers, could survive the enemy's counterfire and deliver their decisive strikes. For the specialized shock cavalry who engaged in melee, heavier but still modular, metal defenses were integrated. The silk armor was the default survival layer, enabling the Mongol doctrine. Even with its inherent vulnerabilities against dedicated stabbing weapons, it was a trade-off that Genghis Khan was clearly willing to make, prioritizing the ability to reach and break the enemy formation over absolute close quarters invulnerability. To truly appreciate the engineering brilliance of the Mongol silk armor, we must place it in the context of other contemporary forms of textile defense. The Mongols were not the only civilization to realize the protective power of layered fabric, but their application of silk set their armor apart. We look now at historical comparisons, specifically the Japanese use of silk and the ubiquitous European gambeson. Consider the Japanese samurai. They certainly used silk, but their method was distinct. A mainstream historical fact is that Japanese armor, oyoroi or domaru, often incorporated silk cording and lacing. These vibrant, intricately tied silk cords were used to connect the many small iron or leather plates cozaine of their lamellar armor. The silk provided exceptional strength, flexibility, and resistance to snapping, allowing the plates to move independently while remaining strongly bound. The silk's role here was structural and connective. Not ballistic, it held the armor together, but it wasn't the primary anti-projectile layer. Now, contrast this with the European gambeson. This was perhaps the most common piece of armor in medieval Europe, worn by everyone from poor archers to wealthy knights underneath their mail or plate. The gambeson was a thick, padded jacket, usually made of linen or cotton, quilted vertically or horizontally. It was highly effective against blunt trauma, providing a necessary cushion beneath the mail, and could even stop a weakly struck arrow. However, its core function was cushioning and padding, relying on the sheer thickness of the compressed material to absorb energy. Cotton and linen, while cheap and plentiful, lacked the microscopic tensile strength of silk. A dedicated armor-piercing arrowhead would often penetrate a gambeson if it did unhit a structural element or a layer of mail. The quirky tidbit here is that the word gambeson itself might derive from an Arabic term for a type of quilted garment, suggesting the technology of padded armor spread widely across cultures long before the Mongol era. Proving the fundamental concept of layering was sound, historians still argue whether the Mongol silk armor should be considered a type of gambeson or a unique invention. The difference lies in the critical core function. The European gambeson was primarily designed to absorb shock and prevent mail from pinching. Its arrow protection was secondary. The Mongol silk layer, on the other hand, was specifically engineered, using a height-tensile material for the primary ballistic function of snaring the projectile, with the outer padding only serving a supporting, shock-absorbing role. It was a targeted, specialized defense, whereas the gambeson was a general-purpose, ubiquitous padding layer. The Mongols innovated by identifying a superior fiber and placing it strategically inside the shock-absorbing layers, directly over the body. They took the basic concept of the quilted jacket and upgraded its performance exponentially, using silk. You, as the Mongol rider, are wearing a garment that shares the quilted look of the European gambeson. But its core component is fundamentally different and far more effective against the projectile threat that dominated their warfare. This focused engineering allowed them to maintain a military edge over armies encumbered by heavy, slower forms of protection. The true impact of the Mongol silk armor wasn't purely physical, it was deeply psychological. The ability of the Mongol cavalry to weather volleys of arrows without breaking formation or suffering high casualty rates imparted a powerful, terrifying psychological edge over their opponents. Imagine yourself as an archer for a European or Islamic army trained to expect your arrows to reliably penetrate the standard defenses of the animalita, thin metal, or even unarmored flesh. You fire volley after volley into the approaching, lightly armored Mongol horsemen. You see the arrows strike, the padded coats, and you see the men flinch from the impact. But then, you see them keep riding. They don't fall. They don't reel away with arrows pinned deep into their torsos. A mainstream historical fact is that the sheer tenacity of the Mongol advance, even under heavy enemy fire, often shattered the morale of their opponents before the armies even met in melee. The opposing soldiers were used to seeing a body count rise quickly under sustained fire. The sight of seemingly unpierceable men closing the distance was utterly demoralizing. The Mongol forces carefully cultivated this aura of invincibility. Their swiftness and their discipline meant that they never gave the enemy a clear, vulnerable target, and when they were hit, their rate of disabling wounds was remarkably low. This created the battlefield folklore that the Mongols were somehow magically protected or were a force of nature that simply couldn't be stopped by human weapons. The quirky tidbit here is that in some accounts from the Middle East enemy scouts reported that the Mongol riders seemed to have a terrifying indifference to being hit, often simply pulling the snagged arrow out of their coat and throwing it to the ground before continuing the charge. This perceived stoicism, facilitated by the armor's ability to minimize life-threatening wounds, fed the narrative that they were superhuman. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of the Mongol armies there, disciplined terror and speed, was a greater factor in their success than any single piece of technology, including the silk armor. It's a chicken and egg question. The silk armor made the tactics possible, and the tactics magnified the psychological effect. You can't have the terrifying, relentless speed without the high survivability rate. And you can't instill that fear without the soldiers believing they are protected. You, the enemy soldier. Realize the arrows you painstakingly crafted and shot with all your strength are essentially useless. The enemy cavalry is not slowing down. This realization triggers panic breakdown in cohesion. Your formation wavers. The Mongols, seeing this, press their advantage instantly, riding into the gap created by your fear and confusion. The silk armor, by turning a likely casualty into a mere flesh wound or just a bad bruise, ensured the Mongol cavalry remained a cohesive, aggressive, and psychologically crushing unit. The material worked not just on the body of the rider, but on the mind of the foe. Moving from the psychological impact to the granular detail, the true engineering secret behind the silk armor wasn't just the presence of silk, but the precise implementation of weave density and tension. This is where the textile workers elevated the garment from simple padding to a high-performance ballistic material. A mainstream historical fact is that the protective quality of fabric armor is exponentially related to the number of individual threads per unit area, or the thread count. The Mongols didn't use loose, flowing silk. They utilized a tightly woven fabric, often of a multiply construction, meaning that each visible strand was itself composed of several finer silk filaments twisted together. This maximized the sheer volume of material that the arrow tip had to encounter. Imagine the difference between pushing a needle through a loose curtain versus a canvas sail. The tightly woven structure of the silk fabric, combined with the dense layers, presented an immense barrier. The tighter the weave, the less space there was between the fibers, forcing the arrow tip to directly impact and stretch the heightened-styled protein filaments rather than slipping through a gap. But density alone wasn't enough. The tensioning process was vital. Remember the quilting we discussed? The tight stitching that bound the 8 to 10 layers of silk together was not just for cohesion. It was a way of pre-stressing the material. By pulling the layers taut and fixing them firmly with dense stitches, the engineers created a fabric composite that was already under high internal tension. When the arrow struck, the fabric didn't have to first absorb the energy needed to take up the slack. It was instantly ready to resist the localized force. The quirky tidbit here is that the Mongols sometimes utilized a method of pressing or flattening the finished armor coats, possibly under weights, or even by being worn tightly for a period to further compress and increase the effective density of the entire composite layer, maximizing the fabric's resistance to compression and penetration. Historians still argue whether the choice of raw silk, which filaments could be significantly stronger than cultivated silk, was ever systematically prioritized by the Mongol supply chain, or if they simply used the best quality that their captured workshops could provide in bulk. The core principle, however, remained. The material needed to be strong, and it needed to be held taut. You, the engineer, understand that the goal is not to stop the arrow by breaking it, but by dissipating its kinetic energy across the widest possible area of the silt. The high weave density ensures that the energy is spread across hundreds of tightly interlocked fibers, and the high tension ensures that every fiber immediately participates in the load-bearing process. This combined effect causes the fibers to stretch dramatically at the point of impact, creating the powerful, momentary netting effect that captures and halts the projectile. It is this specific combination of thread-level strength and macroscopic structural tension that truly differentiates the Mongol silk armor, transforming a simple piece of clothing into a highly effective ancient form of ballistic fabric. The revolutionary defense system of layered silk required an equally revolutionary logistical capability to sustain it. The Mongols could not have outfitted their vast armies with this high-grade textile if they hadn't mastered the logistics of supply, specifically their control and repurposing of the legendary Silk Roads. When Genghis Khan and his successors shattered the established empires of Asia, they didn't just win territory, they seized control of the world's most valuable arteries of commerce. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mongol Empire consolidated control over the entire network of trade routes spanning from China to the Middle East, effectively creating an era known as the Pax Mongolica. This centralization of power was directly leveraged to ensure a constant, stable supply of the necessary raw material. Silk. Imagine the scale of the requirement. Equipping tens of thousands of cavalrymen with garments requiring 8 to 10 layers of tightly woven fabric, which then had to be replaced or repaired after engagements, demanded an industrial level of textile production. The Mongols didn't just tax the silk, they requisitioned it, turning captured Chinese weaving centers and skilled artisans into military production hubs. Silk moved along the trade routes, not primarily as luxury goods destined for Venice, but as essential military material destined for the battlefields of Persia, Russia, and Hungary. The continuity of supply was a strategic weapon in itself. While their enemies struggled with localized, inefficient armor production each night, often relying on local smiths and small workshops, the Mongols could command the output of an entire continent's textile industry. This guaranteed that every new recruit, every replacement, and every repaired garment met the precise, standardized specifications demanded by the engineers. The quirky tidbit here is that the immense demand for silk for military use arguably led to some standardization of silk production. Techniques across the newly acquired territories, as military specifications are often excellent, drivers of quality control and mass production efficiency. Historians still argue whether the logistical demands of the silk armor eventually led to any significant decline in the quality of silk used for trade and luxury items as the military absorbed the best grades for its own defensive needs. It is clear, however, that the military always received priority. The armor was a critical state asset. You, the quartermaster, are now tracking bales of silk alongside herds of horses and sacks of dried meat. This is the new logistical reality of the Mongol military. The Silk Road is no longer just a path for merchants. It is the lifeline of the cavalry. It is the supply chain that keeps your most valuable asset, the veteran soldier, alive and fighting. By integrating their supply of silk directly into their conquest, the Mongols ensured that their revolutionary armor system was sustainable, scalable, and reproducible, allowing their relentless expansion to continue decade after decade, fueled by the tiny, tenacious output of the silkworm. The availability of heightened style fabric became a strategic resource, as critical as iron or grain. The Mongol engineers, in their relentless pursuit of troop efficiency and survivability, stumbled upon an extraordinary, though secondary, benefit of the silk armor system that lay in the realm of battlefield medicine. This was the unique medical advantage offered by the silk lining, transforming a potentially fatal injury into a far more manageable one, thus creating a kind of mobile Mongol hospital. We have established that the silk's primary function was to snare the arrow tip, halting penetration. But what happened in the relatively infrequent cases, when the arrow struck with enough force and sharpness to pierce the entire depth of the multi-layered defense? A mainstream historical fact is that even when the arrow fully penetrated the body, the silk fibers surrounding the point would often be drawn into the wound channel along with the arrowhead. Imagine the arrow now embedded in the soldier's flesh. When a traditional arrow, one that has passed through loose leather or mails, removed the jagged metal, tip, and any attached fragments of dirty cloth or splintered wood, can cause severe secondary tearing, dragging contaminants deeper into the wound and increasing the risk of immediate hemorrhage and subsequent massive infection. The silk-lined wound, however, was fundamentally different, because the height-tensile silk fibers had wrapped tightly around the arrowhead and shaft. When the arrow was carefully pulled out, the silk acted like a smooth, sterile sheath. The silk often pulled the arrowhead cleanly through the tissue, simultaneously clearing the wound channel of loose debris, dirt, and fragments of the outer padding. This significantly reduced tissue damage and minimized the introduction of external contaminants deep into the body. The quirky tidbit here is that this specific medical benefit led to a unique practice among Mongol medics, often Chinese or Persian physicians, conscripted into service. They would meticulously examine the pull-it-out arrow shaft. If silk fibers were clearly visible wrapped around the point, they knew the prognosis was significantly better. As the wound was likely cleaner and the arrowhead was intact and fully removed, historians still argue whether the Mongols deliberately positioned the silk layer closest to the body with the intent of leveraging this medical benefit, or if it was simply a happy accident resulting from maximizing the silk's primary ballistic function, which required it to be held taut against the skin. Regardless of intent, the medical outcome was clear. Wounds from penetrating arrows in Mongol soldiers were demonstrably cleaner and less prone to immediate disabling complications. This dramatically improved the recoverability of the troops. A man who survived the immediate impact of the arrow and who received a cleaner wound had a much higher chance of returning to the fight quickly. This reduced the overall attrition rate of the Mongol army, a key factor in maintaining their long-term campaigning ability. You, the medic, see this as an incredible advantage. A wound that would have been a death sentence or long-term disability for an opposing soldier often becomes a survivable injury for your Mongol patient, all thanks to that silk bulletproof underwear. The silk was an integrated part of their war machine, protecting the soldier both from the immediate mechanical impact and the subsequent biological threat. The Mongol invasion of Europe in the 13th century, culminating in the major battles of Legnica and Mohi, 1241, provided a jarring real-world test of the silk armor against a completely different set of opponents, resulting in widespread shock and awe in the West. European chroniclers struggled to comprehend the resilience of the seemingly lighter-moored invaders. Imagine you are a Polish or Hungarian knight, encased in your expensive heavy mail and surcoat. Confident in your defenses, your forces are arrayed against the Mongol scouts and light cavalry. Men who appear to be wearing simple leather or padded jackets, no shining plate, no visible mail. You are confident that your archers, particularly the experienced crossbowmen, will easily dispatch these poorly protected horsemen. A mainstream historical fact is that the battles of Legnica against the Polish and German forces and Mohi against the Hungarian army resulted in devastating, almost incomprehensible defeats for the European forces. A critical factor in these victories was the Mongol ability to absorb the initial volleys of European arrows and crossbow bolts with minimal loss of combat effectiveness. When the European arrows struck the Mongol riders, the result was often mystifying. The projectiles would impact the quilted armor and either bounce off the outer leather layers or be snagged by the inner silk. The knights and archers expected to see the light cavalry fall in droves, pinned by their shafts. Instead, the Mongols simply absorbed the hit, often visibly flinching from the blunt trauma, but remaining in the saddle and immediately returning fire with their superior composite bows. The quirky tidbit here is that one of the common tactical errors made by the European forces was assuming the Mongols were unarmored or poorly armored, leading them to misjudge the range and duration of the initial skirmishes. The heavily armed European knights, often struggling in the mud, were slow to maneuver, allowing the Mongol forces to fully utilize their speed and archery superiority, which was underpinned by their own survivability. Historians still argue whether the shock of the Mongols' apparent invulnerability was a greater factor in the European rout than their innovative tactics, like feigned retreats and superior communication. It is clear, however, that the failure of the Europeans' primary anti-cavalry weapon, the arrow to stop the charge, was a massive blow to morale and confidence. You see the bewildered faces of your archers as their bolts, which usually pierce 3 layers of leather, simply stick in the enemy's coats without drawing blood. This encounter demonstrated that the Mongol engineers had created a defense system perfectly optimized to defeat the most common battlefield weapon across 2 continents. In Europe, the silk armor proved its worth against both the English longbow and areas where the Mongols advanced. Further west, and the powerful but slow-loading crossbow, the lightly protected Mongol cavalry could ride through the storm of projectiles, deliver their own relentless fire, and maintain their cohesion, leaving the heavily armored Europeans slow, bewildered, and ultimately decimated. The armor allowed them to fight their fight, not the enemy's. The Mongol Empire's military successes and the observed effectiveness of their light, flexible armor system initiated a critical process of diffusion of technology across Eurasia. Armies who survived and later fought the Mongols, or those who traded with them, quickly realized the strategic advantage of lightweight, arrow-resistant armor and began to adopt and adapt the concept. Imagine the defeated forces returning home, not with tales of insurmountable steel, but of lightly clad horsemen who refused to die from arrow wounds. The realization spread. Speed and survivability against projectiles were more critical than heavy plate resistance in a world dominated by archery. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, who eventually halted the Mongol expansion, quickly incorporated elements of light, quilted armor into their own forces, recognizing the necessity of matching the Mongols' defensive agility. The Mamluks, masters of equestrian warfare, blended their traditional scale and mail armor with padded fabric-based layers, similar in principle to the Khatan Del, prioritizing mobility for their own rapid cavalry maneuvers. The concept then traveled further west and into the Ottoman Empire and Eastern Europe. The heavily quilted garments influenced later forms of Eastern European cavalry armor, often resulting in coats that combined smaller metal plates with heavy padding. These adaptations recognized the Mongol principle, used textiles for bulk and anti-projectile netting, and metal sparingly for vital area rigidity. The quirky tidbit here is that while the silk itself was often replaced by cheaper materials like linen or cotton in poorer regions, reverting to a high-performance gambeson, the fundamental design principle of high-density layering and quilting for ballistic resistance, derived from the Mongol example, remained consistent. The lesson was the structure. Historians still argue whether the transition away from heavy European plate armor in the later medieval period was due more to the increasing effectiveness of firearms requiring thicker, heavier plates, making them even more cumbersome, or the enduring lesson of the Mongol campaigns, which demonstrated that high mobility and archery defense were strategically superior. It was likely a confluence of both, but the Mongols certainly provided a powerful early-stage lesson in minimizing weight without sacrificing protection against the era's primary weapon. Ultimately, the silk armor technology became a key link in the evolution of personal protection. The principle of using height-and-style layered fibers to absorb and disperse kinetic energy laid the conceptual groundwork for centuries of future innovation, eventually leading to the development of early soft armors for protection against low-velocity firearms. The diffusion of this simple, yet revolutionary textile technology fundamentally shifted the paradigm of defensive warfare across the continents. As the stories of the Mongol conquests spread, so too did the tales of their seemingly magical arrow-proof armor. This gave rise to a necessary process of sifting through the historical record to separate myth versus reality, to distinguish verifiable facts about the silk armor from the inevitable exaggerations and battlefield folklore. Imagine listening to a frightened survivor of the Mongol advance recounting their experience to a skeptical Western audience. The armor's effectiveness was so far outside their frame of reference that hyperbolic accounts became commonplace. A mainstream historical fact is that famous travelers like Marco Polo, who spent time within the Mongol sphere of influence, Recorded, detailed, but sometimes embellished observations of Mongol customs and military technology, including their use of layered defenses and reliance on speed. Marco Polo, for instance, noted the impressive quality and volume of the Mongols' armaments, and accounts attributed to him and others spoke of the layers of heavy felt and the protective properties of the garments. However, these accounts often failed to differentiate between the layered felt for shock absorption and the distinct, heightened-style silk layer, responsible for the snaring effect, sometimes simply referring to the armor as thick leather or felt. The myth often arose from the perspective of the enemy. They could impossibly be defeated by lightly armored men unless those men were wearing something supernatural. This led to exaggerated claims of armor that was completely impervious to any weapon, even a dedicated thrust. The quirky tidbit here is that one common piece of Mongol folklore among their enemies was that the horses' armor was made of hardened rhinoceros hide, or sometimes paper, and that the men's armor contained mystical, unbreakable metal plates forged under the light of the full moon. Clear attempt to rationalize the unbelievable performance of the textile layers. Historians still argue whether the most accurate descriptions of the silk armor come from the official histories of the defeated Chinese dynasties, who had the most intimate knowledge of the material science, or from the later Persian and Mamluk chroniclers who fought the Mongols, and had a vested interest in replicating their success. The consensus relies on the Chinese records and archaeological finds that confirm the multilayered quilted construction using high-density fabric. You, the modern historian, must apply scientific skepticism. The silk armor was not truly bulletproof or arrow-proof in the absolute sense. It was statistically resistant to the high-velocity, small-diameter threat of the common battlefield arrow. It drastically improved the probability of survival and minimally reduced the severity of wounds, but it did not grant invulnerability. It was a product of brilliant, pragmatic engineering, not magic. By separating the strategic effectiveness from the exaggerated folklore, we can fully appreciate the true, measurable impact of this ancient textile technology on the course of military history. Given the undeniable effectiveness of the silk lining, a natural question arises. Why not full silk? Why did the Mongol engineers not simply outfit their soldiers in 10 layers of pure, unadulterated silk, thus maximizing the tensile protection? The answer lies in the fundamental issues of cost, complexity, and structural limitations. Imagine attempting to produce a fully silk-based defensive garment on an industrial scale. A mainstream historical fact is that even after conquering the Silk Road, silk remained an extraordinarily valuable commodity, producing the sheer volume of continuous filament needed to create 10 thick layers for every soldier horse armor. An officer would have rapidly depleted imperial coffers and diverted resources away from other crucial military expenditures, such as metalworking for swords and arrowheads, or maintaining the massive horse herds. It simply wasn't economically feasible to make silk the bulk material. The complexity of working with silk on that scale was also a factor. While silk is incredibly strong, it is also fine and requires careful processing, weaving, and stitching to maintain its tensile integrity. If the armor needed to be repaired quickly in the field, it was much faster and easier for the soldier to replace a torn layer of coarse, cheap felt or cotton than to meticulously reweave or restitch a section of delicate silk fabric. Crucially, silk, on its own, lacked the necessary structural support and shock absorption. The silk layer's function was to snare the projectile, but it did a poor job of mitigating blunt force trauma. Remember the secondary threat? Without the thick, compressible padding of cotton and felt, the arrow's kinetic energy would be transferred almost directly into the body, potentially causing severe internal injuries even without skin penetration. The quirky tidbit here is that despite the military need, silk still maintained such high cultural value that it was often used as a form of currency or reward within the Mongol system. Therefore, utilizing it purely for bulk defense would have devalued a key tool of political economy. Historians still argue whether the engineers ever experimented with a pure silk garment or if the multi-layered textile composite system was their immediate goal. It's highly likely that early testing showed the crucial role of the padding in preserving the soldier's ability to fight after being hit. The padding reduced the disabling pain of the impact, while the silk layer ensured the hit was survivable. The final form of the Khatan Dadel was therefore a highly optimized compromise. It used the cheap, plentiful bulk of felt and cotton to provide the thickness and cushioning, and then strategically integrated the expensive, high-performance silk fiber at the point where it mattered most, the final barrier against penetration. It was the perfect blend of cost efficiency and battlefield effectiveness. The armor remained a system of components, where the silk was the critical but strategically limited ingredient. You are thankful for that thick felt padding, because without it, even a successful stop by the silk would leave you gasping on the ground, temporarily neutralized. The story of the Mongol silk armor is not confined to the 13th century. It serves as a foundational chapter in the history of materials, science, and personal protection, laying the conceptual groundwork for technologies we use today. This ancient layered defense has a direct legacy of layering, the modern connection. Imagine looking at a modern soldier's vest made of high-tech ballistic fabric like Kevlar or Dyneema. The core principle at work is precisely the same as the one discovered by the Mongol engineers, stopping a high-velocity projectile by using multiple layers of heightened silistrunk material to snare the projectile and disperse its kinetic energy. A mainstream historical fact is that modern ballistic armors do not stop bullets primarily through rigidity like steel plate, but through the combined strength of densely woven synthetic fibers. Kevlar, for example, is a fiber with incredible tensile strength, designed to stretch and spread the bullet's force across a wide network of fibers, capturing the projectile in a net before it can penetrate the layers. The Mongol insight was that the projectile's energy is best managed by making the impacting surface flexible yet resilient, rather than rigid and deflective. This marked the start of the soft armor concept. They used silk protein filaments. We use aramid or polyethylene polymers. The engineering objective remains identical: maximize tensile strength and utilize layering to sequentially absorb and dissipate energy. The quirky tidbit here is that in laboratory tests conducted by some modern military historians, densely quilted silk, when optimized for thickness and stitching, has been shown to be effective at significantly slowing down and sometimes fully stopping low velocity. Non-jacketed lead musket balls from the 17th century, a testament to the enduring effectiveness of the heightened layered approach. Historians still argue whether the historical awareness of textile defenses influenced the 20th century inventors of modern ballistic fabric, or if the modern materials were a completely independent rediscovery of the layering principle. Regardless, the functional similarities are striking. You are now examining the similarities. In both the ancient and modern systems, you have a soft outer layer. In the Katandadel, it was felt or cotton for initial shock absorption. In modern armor, it might be ceramic plating or composite layers for high-energy dissipation. The critical heightened core, silk in the 13th century, Kevlar or Dyneema today, this layer provides the actual snaring and penetration resistance. Layering and tension. Both systems rely on dozens of plies of material held tightly together to ensure that the force of the projectile is distributed across the maximum number of fibers. The Mongol engineers didn't have access to polymers, but they correctly identified and harnessed the strongest natural fiber available on Earth for kinetic energy absorption. Their silk armor stands as a powerful, ancient precedent for lightweight, flexible protection. It proves that materials science, driven by strategic military needs, is a timeless endeavor. Linking the nomadic inventor on the step directly to the modern ballistic engineer in the laboratory, we conclude our journey by reflecting on the source of this profound innovation, the architect of defense, the brilliant, pragmatic engineering spirit of Genghis Khan and his anonymous corps of artisans and strategists. The layered silk armor was more than a technical solution. It was a symbol of a military culture that prioritized adaptability over tradition. Genghis Khan's genius lay not just in his devastating tactics, but in his ability to identify and embrace effective innovation, regardless of its origin or its material cost. He shattered the rigid military traditions that dictated armor must be heavy and metallic to be effective. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mongols maintained specialized teams of engineers, darugachi, or supervisors, whose sole task was to integrate conquered technologies and materials into the Mongol war machine, ensuring constant refinement of weapons and armor. The silk armor encapsulates this philosophy perfectly. It was a solution born out of necessity, the need for lightweight, long campaign protection, but executed with technical mastery. Leveraging a seemingly delicate material for maximum ballistic effect, they did not settle for the existing options. They engineered a new one. The quirky tidbit here is that the Mongols' pragmatic approach meant they were also masters of utilizing enemy armor against them. Captured metal armor was not melted down, but often repaired, resized, and issued to the Mongol heavy units, often non-Mongol contingents, showcasing their commitment to functional recycling. Historians still argue whether the single greatest factor in the Mongols' ability to hold the world's largest contiguous empire was their sheer military discipline, or this profound enduring commitment to practical innovation, such as the silk armor. The two are inseparable. The innovation allowed the discipline to be maintained across vast distances. Imagine one final time the Mongol rider, light, fast, tireless. His outer leather coat is scuffed and worn, but beneath it, the 10 layers of tightly stitched silk are ready to absorb the impact of any incoming arrow. This defense was the silent partner in their conquests. It reduced casualties, minimized logistical burdens, maximized mobility, and struck fear into the hearts of their opponents. The legacy of the Mongol engineers is a testament to the fact that effective defense is not about using the heaviest material, but the right material in the right configuration. They chose height-tensile fiber over rigid steel, demonstrating a profound early understanding of energy dissipation that predates modern composite science by 8 centuries. The silk armor proves that true military genius often lies not in the ferocity of the charge, but in the calculated, quiet genius of the design. The world's first true bulletproof textile was the ultimate enabler of the Mongol Empire, turning a piece of delicate, luxurious underwear into the most consequential protective garment of the medieval world. Now, as the distant echoes of the Mongol horsemen fade into the vastness of the steppe, we can slow our pace and ease out of this intense deep dive. You can let go of the tension of the battlefield, the dust, and the whistling arrows. We have spent nearly 26,000 words tracing the path of a tiny silkworm thread from a luxury item to a cornerstone of empire history, woven as tightly as the armor itself. It's astonishing to realize how a simple, pragmatic decision that speed must not be sacrificed for safety could lead to such a revolutionary piece of engineering. The genius of the Mongols wasn't brute force. It was the calculated application of superior logistics and material science. Take a deep breath now. Let your shoulders relax. The journey is complete, and the armor has served its purpose. Everything is quiet now, just the faint, soft hum of the night air. Thank you, truly, for spending this time with me. If you found a moment of fascination in this ancient story, perhaps I'll see you again for the next one. Until then, drift off with the comfort of knowing that even the most complex problems sometimes have the simplest, softest solutions. Sleep well.